Mobilize.net, your app, new again.
Hi, John.
Hi, Keith.
We've both been working with Visual Basic for many, many years. I think I started with VB 1.0 and then various flavors of Basic before that. And it's nice to see that we can find a way to move some of our legacy knowledge and technology and so on up into the modern era. What's your role with Mobilize.net?
Well, I'm the technical product manager, which means that I get to work with the product team, and I also work with the marketing group. So I write a lot of the content that we have on our website and some of the pieces that we send out to people to try and help them understand the product and how to use it a little bit.
Okay. Are you a technical guy or a marketing guy?
I'm a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got, kind of one technical shoe and one marketing shoe.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So the context, I guess, what we're going to talk about today is moving what we would consider legacy apps into a modern era, putting them on the web.
Absolutely.
And so maybe we should start with, legacy is a different thing to anybody, right? That's just something that they inherited last week. It's not their app, it's legacy. So what kind of legacy apps are we going to be talking about?
Well, of course, real legacy means COBOL, or 360 assembly.
There you go.
But we're not going to talk about that, thank
No.
goodness, because I don't have an answer for that.
And that was before my time.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't before either of our time. But what I am going to talk about today, and the place that Mobilize.net is really focused on is Windows. Okay, so when I say Windows, it could be VB6, it could be even older than that. We actually just did a project for a company whose name I can't mention, but you'd recognize it. That was VBA. They had a lot of VBA stuff, and they were able to take it off and rewrite the business logic into C# and stuff like that.
So reusing a good chunk of their investment.
Yeah. They had to do something with the Office pieces, the Excel stuff, and things like that.
Right.
But that's not that difficult a problem to recreate. But they had a lot of logic, which they wanted to preserve. And of course, that's sort of the essence of legacy apps. If they're still around, it's because they have some intrinsic value. And I think what's probably safe to say is that a lot of that value is in business logic and algorithms and the encapsulation of business processes that have sort of been sorted out over the years of being used. They've been basically debugged, right?
Right.
And so, if you say, well, here's an app and, we've had it for 10 years, but it's obsolete or whatever, and we're going to create a new app that fulfills the same business purpose by starting from scratch, then not only do you have to do all of the design work and specification work, but not only do you have to debug all the normal bugs that you're going to create, but you've got those bugs in the business process logic or all of those things that have already been debugged in this old code. So if you had a way to move that old code to a new platform and not introduce new bugs, you could really get a jump start on building a more modern architecture on a more modern platform without necessarily having a big mess in your hands. So that's sort of what we do at Mobilize. We build tools and services to do that.
So you use the word obsolete. And I guess the important thing is that the business process part of it isn't obsolete. What's obsolete is probably the presentation technology, how people interact with it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. What we saw in the past was people wanted to move from VB to WinForms. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, in an age of desktop computing and laptop computing and captive machines to desktop, that made a lot of sense. But today, what do people want? They want an app that they can access from an iPad or from an Android tablet or a smartphone, or maybe even I see I brought my Windows machine, you brought your MacBook. Okay, and I see more and more of my colleagues, even if they're solidly in the Windows stack from a development standpoint, I see them liking, what the ergonomics and the weight, the battery, and the performance and so forth of the Macintosh bring them. Okay, so that means that maybe you want an application that can be rendered in a browser, so you eliminate all of those limiting factors for what kind of a device can people use, right?
So that's the lowest common denominator is everybody has a browser, right? Phone, tablet, and PC.
And I think you can safely say that today with HTML5 and the JavaScript frameworks and all of the different pieces that are available today, there's really not much that you can't do in something that's completely portable that can run on, any modern browser running on any kind of OS or hardware, right?
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So the customers that you guys have been working with so far, what kind of apps are they investing in? Are they customer-facing apps?
Great question.
Things they sell? Or?
Great question. We do have some customers who are ISVs. They have written software that they're selling as a license mechanism, and they typically want to move to a subscription, a SaaS model. But when you look at the kind of stuff that we see a lot of, it's a line of business application. It's basically forms over data. Okay, so I'm going down to Texas next week to talk to a company that moved an app, and it did everything for their company. Right, it did everything except present a customer view. So it handled inventory, it handled orders, it handled payroll, it handled HR, it handled factory processes for creation of parts, and location and
entire
shipping.
ERP system.
It was like their own homegrown ERP system,
Right.
And so you could argue that you could replace that with SAP or Salesforce or something, but again, they've got their business processes coded up in this thing.
Sure.
And they can get to something new that works, right, and it's familiar quicker than they could with off-the-shelf software and the customizations and writing custom code and then sorting it all out probably and retraining people. People bring us Power Builder applications. Silverlight, now that Silverlight really isn't supported in Chrome or IE anymore, right?
Right.
Or I don't think it's supported in Firefox. I can't remember if they've dropped support
Well,
for
it's
that.
not strategic going forward, that's for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, definitely. So people want to take those apps and move them to pure HTML for the presentation side, right?
Right.
Definitely, we see C# and VB.NET apps that want to move to the web. We've in the past have done things like Unisys Link. Okay, so a variety of different things, not procedural languages like COBOL.
You mentioned forms over data.
Yes.
And so that would be what we would have called a client-server architecture?
Sure, absolutely. Very common from, the 90s forward for a long time, I would say.
And again, you could do client-server with a variety of technologies. You could build it today if that's what you wanted. Then the next, I guess, evolution was a multi-tier, or at least a 3-tier architecture. So you want to talk about how the technologies, mapped in let's say a 3-tier architecture, and
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. So if you think about 2-tier, you've got forms over data, typically, right? And I think normally what you see is a sort of the classic code behind approach, which is you have event handlers on those forms, right, on the objects on those forms, and you're referencing them directly, okay? So, and that's fine, okay, but it makes it a little harder to test, and it makes it a little harder to move it to something else, right?
Okay.
So, I think the 3-tier or even the N-tier approach, but the 3-tier approach where basically you've got a presentation, and then you've got the business logic that has a way of referencing that presentation, or the view, if you will. And then you've got all of your data back here, okay? And so if you abstract the first tier and the last tier, in effect, from the business logic, then, through an abstraction to the database, you can swap that database out with a completely different database server. I mean, you could swap SQL Server out with Oracle, and it shouldn't affect the business logic a bit.
Right.
And the same thing true to a certain extent with the client presentation, which is, if you're abstracting that. Okay, so I think the thing that's very more and more common today that sort of enables that is some form of MVC, model view controller, or model view presentation is what some people use, or model view model. And we have adopted that very strongly in our latest tools for migrating apps to the web.
Sounds good. So MVC, Model View Controller, is kind of the prototypical one built into ASP.NET, and certainly I think I saw something like truly millions of downloads of various versions of the ASP.NET MVC framework. But we have been talking about forms-based stuff. So now you can do MVC with rich forms, or is that going to have to change the model to put it into that kind of a technology?
Well, no, you can absolutely have rich forms. And again, talking about, we sort of made up this word, webify, okay? Webifying these captive desktop apps, webifying Windows apps. You're going to take those forms that you did have, let's assume that you're talking about a .NET application. So you had this .NET wonderful set of libraries, these runtimes, that would build these forms, for the user. Okay?
These are Windows forms?
Yeah, let's
Okay.
talk Windows forms.
Yeah.
Okay, so classic straight-ahead way to write, Windows code. You practically learn how to, you can learn how to write Hello World in 10 minutes with .NET, right?
Sure.
And so, you've got these great design tools, and you've got all these event handlers, and you've got all of these great libraries with all these capabilities. So it makes for a great way to write the app. But when you want to move it over to the web, there's some things that you're going to have to take into consideration. I mean, you can have very rich user interfaces using forms in a web app.
Okay.
But there's clearly...
Web forms?
Well, we don't like to use web forms. The web forms are more of, classic ASP.NET. So we're focused really on what you were just talking about, which is ASP.NET MVC.
Right.
Okay. And to take it one step further, the pattern that we use is then a single page application, right? So you're not swapping pages out. You're just rebuilding that page as the user has events and they get handled. Okay. And then server side refreshes the view, or the model of the view, and sends it back, and then you have something happening on the client side that builds the view dynamically.
Okay.
So given that, the MVC pattern works extremely well, right? Where you're always referencing models of objects rather than referencing objects directly. And by referencing, I'm not talking about memory. I'm talking about, you want to see what happened to a control like a text box or
having a handle to it.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. So instead of grabbing those things and inquiring, what their state is directly, you're always looking at models of them. Okay. And then you let something else take that information and build a view that the user actually can see and interact with.
So that's for the presentation side of it, and then the business logic, which would have been in the business tier. Does that change in this scenario?
No, not really. The main change that people will see when they run their code through our migration engine and look at the output, in terms of the business logic, is that where before they were getting values from controls, let's say, or getting data from controls, and acting on it, after the user does something. Okay? Now they're going to be basically just looking at view models of those controls. Okay. Other than that, the logic stays pretty much the same. Now, we're using dependency injection, inversion of control. Right now we're using the Unity framework.
Okay. Now that was a lot of technology really fast.
Yeah,
do you want to talk about what DI is?
And I don't want to really drill down on that because it would be a rabbit hole that we never get out of. But I will say very quickly that when people look at their code, they will see that we're using a lot of interfaces and we're using inversion of control. So, for example, where you might, in the world of Windows, be very familiar with the idea of instantiating or constructing an object with the new constructor, right? Now you're going to see this sort of container resolve syntax. So to a certain extent, you'll see your code sort of expands a little bit, like a line of code that maybe was new object name, object class and name, now might be container resolve, class name, view model of the object, to construct one. But once you sort of mentally get over that hurdle, code's the code. I mean, other than that sort of abstraction, we're not really changing it. We're not changing the algorithms. We're not changing the object names particularly. We're not changing the comments. So all that stuff is going to stay intact.
Okay. And then what about the data tier and the data?
The data tier is completely intact because, of course, that's all outside of the presentation. So everything that's happening from the data tier back is going to be unchanged.
Okay.
Yeah. How does a web app work? It works with a request and a response, just like a web page does, right?
Okay.
So there's a server over here, literally, physically separate from the application. Could be halfway around the world, could be on Mars, you know.
Okay.
But someday. And so the app, makes a request over HTTP, and the server gets it, says, do I know you? Oh, okay, I'm going to authenticate you and do some token or something. And then,
Okay.
it goes and does its server stuff, and then it brings back an answer and sends it back, right? Well, what happens if the next request doesn't come for a long time? The server is going to take that, that session cache of state, and it's going to throw it away at some point.
Right.
It's going to, so, if your app requires a lot of state, that probably won't work very well as a web application. People talk about stateless apps. I don't believe there is such a thing, except for calculator maybe, but as little state as possible is probably going to work well. So we do see people do really interesting things in their code that you can get away with in Windows. Maybe it wasn't the way Windows was intended to be coded, but maybe the way that they inherit particular objects from other objects, or they create objects dynamically, or use maybe some of the capabilities of .NET that just don't have any corollary on a browser. Okay. And so those things, you're going to have to figure out a way to work around them.
So there must be some things that are challenging to move into a web environment from a rich forms environment. What are the top few things that give you pause?
Great question. You can write any kind of app you can imagine with .NET. So are all of those going to work as a web app? And the answer is no. The best ones, as we talked about, are these line of business apps that are rich forms over data. Okay. Mm-hmm. But apps that are, for example, have a lot of rich graphical elements, like a drawing palette or something like that. Canvas, where you're drawing. That might be difficult to move over because you'd have to recreate all those things with HTML. Okay. Apps that expect to reference a particular piece of hardware or a hardware function on the device. Okay. That could be very difficult to put on a browser because you generally don't have that level of access from a browser into the device that it's sitting on, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of running in a sandbox, kind of the idea. If the app assumes that it has a private process, that can be suspended, or that it has to have multiple threads, that can be very difficult to move over to a web server where you don't get your own process. Everybody's sharing the same process.
You brought up a couple of things there. One is that the server is remote, and so if I imagine if somebody's trying to use their application on the airplane without connectivity, that's
I didn't even think of that.
That's going to be a challenge.
Really good point.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then you mentioned authentication, so there has to be a security concern here. When you put something out into the in the web, then your security is much different than it might have been for a desktop app.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, how do you deal with that security?
Well, let's start with what people typically have already, which is it's easy to forget that when you fire up your Windows computer, there's an authentication process that happens before it even boots, right? Okay. And so, that could be as simple as entering your user password or entering your Windows Live password, for a Windows Live account, which is really common now since Windows 8 forward, I think. Certainly on Windows 10.
For federating your ID.
Yeah, for federating your ID across multiple devices. And it's a great idea, right? And then, of course, inside the corporation, a lot of enterprises use Active Directory, which is a terrific way to control access to resources and services. But now you have a web application, you don't have those things, right?
Right.
So you have a couple of possibilities. One is that you can do your basic challenge response, where you store a user token like a user ID and a password.
Okay.
That's one way. Another way is that you can use some other authentication mechanism that's designed purely for web. You can use Azure Active Directory services if you're already using Active Directory. And now that requires you to host your application on Azure. So that's, from Microsoft's point of view, that's probably a really good idea.
Right.
Maybe if you really want to use AWS, that isn't such a great idea. Okay.
You could probably, I imagine you could do this on Azure Stack if you wanted to run a private cloud and then have your Active Directory
absolutely,
on-prem.
On-prem, private cloud, sure. absolutely. And they're happy to sell you all the pieces you need to make that happen, right?
That's right.
But you do have to think about that, because typically I'm going to guess that the authentication piece isn't part of the app stack. The app developer assumes that the users are, on a Windows app, this user's already been authenticated.
Right.
Maybe I have to do some authentication to log on to the database, so maybe there's a token that has to be exchanged there. But again, we don't change the data tier. Okay, that's so far back that it really doesn't affect what we're doing, because what we're really doing is, my friend Federico likes to say, we slice the user interface off and we rebuild it in HTML.
Okay.
Okay, and that's kind of what we do.
Okay.
Yeah. One other thing, you made me think of it as you were talking, which is, if your app is chatty, if the user interface spends a lot of time talking to the business logic, right? How's that going to work over a network, right? Like, I think a lot of developers
Over a public network.
Well, a public network,
yeah.
So that's true, right? Do you do things in plain text? Do you do things on SSL?
Right.
But the other thing is just performance. We like to sort of maybe design things as if there was unlimited bandwidth and network traffic had no incremental cost, but we know that those things aren't actually true. Okay, so those are some things to think about, right?
Now, another thing, being a VB developer myself from way back, we always went through kind of a make versus buy analysis. And for a developer, it was like, well, I'll just buy a control, or I'll buy a package, or I'll buy, grids and any of that. So now, an app is a combination of stuff that was written and stuff that was purchased.
That's a really good point. One of the great things about VB was the ecosystem that was developed around third-party controls and components. One of the bad things about VB is the ecosystem that was developed, right? Because they were super popular.
Right.
And you can still get Sheridan controls, and Dev Express and those guys are still out there. But if you've rolled your own, or you've got now no longer supported third-party controls, and that's a piece of your app, you got to think about, what are you going to do with it? Right? Like, if it's a grid control is something that, grids are something that'll work great in a browser. We're not talking about like a graphic control or something like graphing control or something, but you can't use that. Maybe you can't use, you certainly have to use a derivative of that control. Maybe the company's still in business and they sell them, or maybe you're just out of luck. Right.
So part of that is just probably inventorying what controls.
I like that word, inventory.
Okay.
Yeah, inventorying your dependencies and see what's available, what makes sense.
What about if you wrote some I would say, DLLs, you had custom COM plus servers. There's all kinds of legacy things to interact with. When you guys do your porting, you have to look at all of that. Are there some of those technologies that are particularly hard?
Well, that's a good question. You can always reference things through COM interop.
Okay.
All right. And there are people who write their own visual controls using COM back in the day, right? So they have a library, a DLL, that they're invoking, and it's doing things, on the form. But those aren't going to work very well, obviously.
On the web, no.
On the web, yeah. But I would say that in the world of line of business apps, most of those that we see are actually doing server-side things. So I'll give you an example. You have a company maybe that has a set of business rules around shipping.
Okay.
And so to be able to access that from a variety of different apps, they just write a library of standard routines, like maybe calculate shipping, create a label, things like that, UPS kinds of things, right? So that's the sort of library that probably, as long as you could run it on the server side, print a label, that kind of fails, but calculate shipping or pick the best vendor or something like that. I'm making this up as I go along, obviously, but
No, you might do a web service to UPS. You say you get tracking info, put that in, inject that into your form, and that would all.
Yeah. And I think that taking advantage of the rich number of and type of web services that are available today is anybody moving to the web should really think about that, right? I mean, there's a lot of things available like UPS, right?
Right.
Like all kinds of things. So, looking to see, can I replace some homegrown functionality with
Right.
something that a vendor is offering, maybe for no cost at all, right?
Right.
Mhm.
So John, we were just talking about using controls and things from third parties. In the web, are there equivalent libraries and things that you could use today? And in fact, do you use some of those in your ported projects?
Oh, we use so much open source today. It's amazing.
That's good. That means it's all free, right?
Yeah, it's
Free like a puppy.
It's absolutely free.
Okay.
Yeah, just like the first joint. So one place that I think a lot of people get a little confused is in the world of Windows, with WinForms, you have a really nice visual designer, a WYSIWYG interactive designer. It's, basically it's exactly like the one we're used to from Visual Basic, right? I mean,
Sure.
You have a form and you drop controls on it and you move them
It's
around.
not like that in the web?
You set properties. No, you can't do that on the web.
Oh.
But a lot of people are like, well, how do you do that with the web? Well, you don't have the designer anymore, right? What you have is you have HTML,
Okay.
But but HTML wasn't really designed to be a graphical presentation thing. It was designed to tag language based on organization
Right.
structures, right? So, I mean, we've really stretched it a lot. But you do have these JavaScript libraries, and there's some just terrific ones that, I'm sure there's Knockout that people are familiar with. We use two right now that are really interesting, I think, to the kinds of applications that are being migrated to the web. So let me just briefly describe them. We use one that's not open source. It's by a company called Telerik,
Okay.
and it's called Kendo UI. And basically what it does is it creates a user interface on the web that looks very similar to a Windows user interface on a Windows form.
Okay.
Okay, so it has basically all of the controls that you have on the toolbox when you're using Visual Studio and building, a WinForm app. And you can size things and organize things and, the user response, and it's very familiar. So this is great for a company, let's say, that has a Windows application and they've got a lot of users and they want to build a version that'll run on a browser, but they don't want to have to retrain all their users. They want the users to think that this is just very familiar. It just starts inside the browser.
Right.
And so Kendo's a great solution for that. It's also a great solution for web or Windows applications that have a lot of controls on the screen. Okay.
What's a lot?
Dozens.
Okay.
Hundreds. Yeah. So, but then there's another framework that we're using, which is AngularJS, and we're using this in conjunction with Bootstrap. And what this does is it creates a more modern look and feel to a web application. And really the main difference is that it's going to be responsive. So when we talk about a responsive application, we're talking about one that the browser can be resized and think side to side. Think the width of the browser window.
The layout.
The layout,
Okay.
yeah.
And
So-
we're used to trying to figure out if the form changes, then I
Yeah.
move things around.
Right.
But now we've got from a phone to a tablet to
Exactly.
a large screen.
Exactly.
So how do you manage that?
Well, if you use Angular and Bootstrap, you have this great library that basically does it for you automatically.
Okay.
And it makes for a great demo. But if you think about a standard application where maybe you've got a menu strip across the top.
All right.
Now, if you take that window and you shrink it, what we're used to, I think, in the Windows world is you get a scroll bar. And you have to scroll the window or your view of the window around, right, so you can see everything. But what Angular and Bootstrap do is they will basically compress that horizontal menu into a vertical menu. Okay, that basically pops out when you click on it. They give you a little icon for it, right? And then it will resize the form elements so that they work inside of the space that's available. Okay.
All right.
The difference probably you're going to see between them is when you think about a classic Windows form where maybe you've got controls discreetly left, in a sort of almost a grid of controls.
In fact, we laid them out on a grid.
They're laid out left to right and top to bottom.
Yeah.
In Angular Bootstrap, they're going to be laid out vertically.
Okay.
And that way you can compress the application and you don't change the order of the controls.
Okay.
So the bad news is it may mean that a field that in Windows or Kendo you might make 50 pixels wide, it could be the width of the screen. Okay, and even let's say you're going to use it to enter a 2-digit integer or something. It doesn't need to be the width of your browser, 1920 pixels wide or whatever, but it doesn't matter because it's responsive. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's really great for some of our customers come to us. They're ISVs. You asked about that earlier. They have applications that they sell, but they were bound to the desktop. They want an application that will scale well on different devices.
Okay.
Okay. And let's face it, not every form will look good on a little tiny 4-inch smartphone.
No.
Okay. But you want something that you don't have, as a developer, you don't have to sit there and say, okay, I need to find out what's my real estate that I have to work with. Now I've got to calculate dynamically the repositioning of every control that was on this form. And, you don't really want to do that.
So once they've ported an app and webified it, what if a customer wants to do something that's platform specific, right? That only works on a device that maybe has a camera, or it only works on a certain file system that might be on that. Can they extend their app to take advantage of those features?
You absolutely can. There's really 3 ways that you can write apps these days. You can write it native, so you can write it for iOS, and you can write a different port it and branch it and write it for Android and write it for Windows. You can write it as straight ahead HTML, in which case it's going to run everywhere. It's not going to be discoverable in the App Store, right? Because, or you can write these hybrid apps, and I think the advantage of the hybrid app is, beside being discoverable in the App Store, is that you can actually call native services or native device hardware capabilities on a particular device, right?
Okay.
So, if you were coming off the desktop or a laptop, chances are you didn't have code that counted on an accelerometer, because I think those are pretty rare in laptops and desktop computers. But all of these mobile devices have them.
Okay.
Right? And so maybe for some reason you want to have that capability.
If it's there.
If it's there.
Right.
We have a sample app, for example, that the idea is it's for an auto insurance agent to go out and record stuff at an accident. So in addition to doing policies and stuff like that, it has this capability where record the details of an accident. You take pictures and stuff like that. So the VB version, the original version, you upload a picture from the file system, right? And then you store it on the database, right? So you have a classic file open kind of dialog to go find a JPEG and attach it to an accident record, and you've got a place on a form where you write down the address for the accident. But when we migrate it to the web, we say, hey, let's just go call Google Maps and say, find my location.
With GPS info.
With the GPS, okay? Right. And let's just use the camera on the device to take pictures of the smashed up car, the damage to the car, right? And so, that's probably a fairly safe bet, because you're thinking about a mobile device. It would be a great tablet application, right? To carry that out in the field. But you're going to probably have to write code so that you won't throw an exception if somebody gets at that place and there's no network connection or there's no camera. Okay.
Got it.
So you're going to write some conditional code. Maybe you're going to write some compiler directives so that you can build different versions. But the thing to remember is that you start down a slippery slope of branching your code for different situations, right? Different platforms, different devices. And for some people, that's a big no-no, right?
Sure.
It's better than having 3 or 4 separate versions,
Right.
right? But maybe for some people, it's not as good as having just one code base and one binary that they can use for everything, right?
Along the lines of taking advantage of new capabilities in the hardware, there must be apps that took advantage of legacy hardware that doesn't exist.
Yeah. We got a call one day from a company that makes an application that they sell to the Department of Motor Vehicles all over the country.
Okay.
And it uses a proprietary printer that prints the little tabs that go on your license plate. And it was a VB app that had to talk to this, I don't think it was using TrueType. I think it was using some proprietary, driver to send whatever code this printer needed to create these tabs. And they were scratching their head, and they kind of realized They couldn't get off of VB until they found some replacement to talk to this printer, something that could actually address it, right? So, that's a great example of people who can get in a sort of a technical cul-de-sac, without really a good way out, right?
Right. I do remember very custom types of printers for things like labels and so on, and in a web world, that's not even a part of your app. How do you handle printing in a webified app?
Well, printing's actually one of the easier things. The typical way is you call something that'll create a PDF. Okay. And then you can call on the server side, and then you can create a URL to just download the PDF to the local session. Okay. And then from that, do with it what you want. That's kind of how you get your boarding pass from United Airlines, right?
So you handle printing by not printing.
We handle printing the way you print is you don't print. If you think about machine controllers and things like that,
right.
Those are a lot harder, obviously. You've got an AD, an analog digital connection somewhere,
right.
and you're going to have to replace that with something else. Doesn't mean you can't,
right?
Like, for example, got a USB port. You can probably figure out a way to make that USB port talk through some layer to a device. But,
right. USB to serial, because we used to do everything over serial ports, COM ports.
Yeah. Or maybe use TCP/IP and have something. I've seen these things that go. You've probably seen them, Ethernet to USB.
Okay.
Right. So you can take a USB device and put it on a TCP network. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about state management.
Oh yeah.
And then I was thinking about state management at scale, right? Again, when you open it up to a large number of simultaneous users, what are the scaling implications of webifying an app that may have had one user at a time on its code base?
It turns out it's a super important question, and it's particularly important for people that are moving an app that had a lot of users, a lot of customers, from Windows over to a web version, right? Because the typical model of a Windows app, a two-tier Windows app, let's say, is that there's a database that's connected through some network port, right? And then you have a lot of machines, each running their own instance of the application, and really the only scale problem is connecting to the database and dealing with CRUD on the database, right? You're creating records, you're updating records, and so forth. That kind of
create, read, update, delete.
Exactly. Yeah. CRUD, right?
Yeah. I just want to be clear.
Yeah. But that's handled by whether you've got SQL Server, you've got Oracle, or whatever, and you've got things that do load balancing and mirroring, and so that's relatively well thought through and works great today. Now, take that app and put it on a web server, and you've got two immediate problems. One is, how many simultaneous sessions can your web server handle, right? Every user that logs onto that web app creates a new session in ASP.NET, right? And so, you start building up the load on the server, right? Because it's got to do a couple of things. It's got to manage the state for each session, and it's got to deal with the requests from each session, right? To go back to the business logic and do some churning. The second problem is as you want to scale this, it means you have to bring more servers on board. So now you're talking about a server farm.
Okay.
Now, here's where it gets interesting, because you don't know when a session request comes in what server it's going to go to. That's the whole point of a server farm, right? They in effect look like one big server, except they're not. So now you have to be able to know what's my state. Okay, so maybe you initiated a session with server 1, and server 1 has cached the state for this session. But the next request from that session, from that user, comes into server 2, so how does it know what the state is? You have to have a way to replicate that state across these servers.
Or the state goes back to the client, and the client sends that state back too, right?
Yeah, but what you're trying to do is not send all the state with every request. I mean,
optimally, yeah.
Yeah, one of our design cornerstones is that we mark the state that's dirty and send basically serialization of what has changed back to the server. The server then responds and sends back only what needs to be changed by in the model for a new view. So you don't want to send a complete image of everything, because it would be really chatty and it wouldn't be performant.
Right.
You're managing the state. So you have a couple of choices. You can use something like Redis, okay? And Redis I don't know a lot about Redis, but my understanding is Redis will work very well to manage state across a farm of servers. Okay. You can use a database. You create, in effect, a SQL database where you've got a record for every piece of state, and then you do exactly what you would do with any other database, which is as something changes, you do an update, right? And then you do lookups for stuff you need, and you send it back to the client, right? Obviously, anytime you're doing a disk I/O, it's going to be incredibly slow compared to an in-memory I/O function, right? So how well does that work? It probably wouldn't be your first choice for scalability, but these are some of the issues. And the reason I said that it's particularly important to people who start with a Windows app is because Windows apps tend to be very control rich. So in a given form, you may have a tremendous amount potentially of state that has to get shipped around, not just back and forth to the server from the client, but among all the servers, floating around, let's say the server farm as a way of taking images and, synchronizing all of the servers at any given moment. Okay, I just got some new state here, okay, on session number 7. I'm going to send this to everybody, so now we're all synchronized at the same level of what state is going on session number 7. And then the server over there gets the next request and it makes a change, right? Sends it back to the client, but it also has to send that change to all the other servers. So everybody always knows what's going on.
Okay.
So these are things that can be expensive. And you have to do some profiling, and sometimes you have to look at how does this app structured, right?
Right.
One of the things we allow people to do is we allow people to mark things and say, we don't want to track state on this, okay? It's either unchanging, it's immutable.
Like state, the
A
state.
label.
Well, okay. Oh, okay.
And but actually, that's a bad
Status,
example
yeah.
because we never actually track state on a label
Right.
because we know a label's immutable.
But things like, like state and country and an address
Yeah.
or something like that.
So things like that. So a customer may choose to go like, I don't want to actually track the state on this, so we're never going to mark it as dirty even if it changes. It's irrelevant. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So that's one of the things.
All right. I was wondering about the skills required to support a webified app. I think we know what it takes to support a classic app, whether it's just a VB or a .NET app. So if we generate something that has Angular, you said, and Kendo, what kind of developer is now going to be maintaining this, or is it going to be two different developers, maybe one for the client state or the client tier, and one for the business logic?
Well, that's a really good question. You could do it that way. A lot of the client presentation are things that people who have done web development are completely familiar with. HTML, CSS, JavaScript.
Right.
Those sorts of technologies that are maybe at a level that makes those kinds of people a little easier to locate than people, let's say, that are C# gurus.
Okay.
The challenge, I think, for a lot of developers is whether they rewrite their Windows application from scratch to run on a browser as a web application, or they migrate it using our technology. They're going to wind up with a stack that's different than what they're used to.
Right.
You can go very far with VB.NET or C#, the .NET runtime, and the tools that are in Visual Studio. You can build a lot. But now as a web app, you're going to have to know things like jQuery and JavaScript and JSON objects and how AJAX works and HTML and CSS and all of those sorts of things.
Okay.
You're going to have to know how to use the developer tools in Chrome or Firefox or IE or Edge to debug your app. You're going to have to know how to use something like Fiddler to see what's going over the wire back and forth, right? You're going to have to use some of the web extensions that are written for Visual Studio.
Okay.
It's hard for anybody to know everything these days, right? You could argue in the VB day you could know everything,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
You know, Charles Petzold probably knew everything there was to know about writing Win32 code, right? But today you've got all these different things in your stack, and you've got to sort of figure out what you're going to focus on, right?
Right.
Yeah.